Welcome, everyone. My name is Yulia Gilic, and I am a member of the founding collective of the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. We are honored to host this event, marking the release of a special issue on racial capitalism and Palestine, co-edited by Ronit Lentin and Kieron Turner in the Journal of Holy Land and Palestine Studies. For us at the Institute, this event is part of the launch of the Coalition to End Zionist Repression. The Coalition to End Zionist Repression aims to combat attacks on people speaking out and organizing for Palestinian liberation and against Zionism. I will put some links for you to learn more about the coalition, the calendar of events that we're organizing, and more about the work of the Institute. And I will add all of those links in the chat. Today's event comes on the heels of a grim anniversary that marked a year of the ongoing and unrelenting genocide of Palestinians in Gaza that Israel continues to perpetuate with no repercussions. Its deadly violence is not letting up. Instead, it is expanding to the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, Iran, and the entire region. And today's event, just as the special issue itself, hopefully offers the lens of racial capitalism to understand and, importantly, to resist settler colonialism, imperialism, and Zionism. So a couple logistical things before I give the floor to the chair of this event, the convener of this conversation, and the co-editor of the special issue, Ronit Lentin, who will introduce the speakers and moderate the conversation between them. So as I mentioned, the event is being recorded. It will be posted on our website. If you want to pose any questions to our guests, you can type your question in the chat throughout the course of the event, but the moderator will get to them during the Q&A portion. And lastly, we are so grateful for all of you in the audience. We're thrilled that you are a part of this conversation. And I hope we won't have to deal with this, but please mute yourself if you're not speaking. Be respectful in your questions and remarks, because I will personally remove anyone who is causing deliberate disruption. And hopefully that's not going to be the case. With this, I'm going to pass the floor to Ronit.
Thank you very much, Yulia, and the Institute of the Critical Study of Zionism. And thank all of you for being here with us today, for marking the publication of the special issue on racial capitalism in Palestine. This, unfortunately, is another deep moment of deep grief and profound rage. Only last week, at least 84 Palestinians were murdered by the Zionist entity in northern Gaza, making the official death toll of the year-long genocide 42,603 people, mostly women and children, the number of injured nearly 100,000, and 1.9 million people displaced. This is 90% of Gaza's population. These numbers do not include people still under the rubble, people who died from hunger and disease. Estimates vary between 186,000 as published by The Lancet and 500,000, like 500,000, which is almost a quarter of the Gaza population. As Yulia said, while perpetrating the genocide, Israel extended the war to the West Bank, where 530 Palestinians at least have been murdered by the entity. And Jewish settlers have harassed the Palestinian locals, expelled them from their homes and demolished their homes and villages under the watchful eyes of the entity's security forces. While constructing of illegal Jewish settlements goes on, and the situation of Palestinians in Al-Quds has been the worst in 40 years. And as Yulia also said, the entity has extended the rampage to Lebanon, to Yemen, and to Iran. Now, my question in my mind all the time, how do we continue to live with all of this? How can we go on? Now, Nahla Abdo and I have worked on our co-edited book on gendered narratives of dislocation of Palestinian and Israeli women at the time of the Al-Aqsa Intifada. At the time, the book was published in 2002, a long time ago. We asked all contributors to take the Al-Aqsa Intifada on board, and they all did. Basically, we called it military confrontation, the book, but of course it was about colonization, settler colonialism, perpetual war. We didn't have this vocabulary then, but we all know it now. Now, working on this current collection with Kieron Turner on racial capitalism, we didn't have to ask the contributors to take on board the Gaza genocide. All papers, in fact, had the Gaza genocide in the paper as part of the analysis. Now, very early on in this genocide, the Zionist, onslaught on Gaza has been called a textbook case of genocide by the Israeli historian Raz Segal and by Palestinians and their supporters and by international agencies, including the UN. But the genocide, which is denied by Israel, continues unabated. And basically it continues the Zionist resolve to eliminate the Palestinian natives in line with the racialization since the 19th century by the Zionist movement. And the Zionist movement constructed European Jews as a superior race and Palestinians as well as non-European and Arab Jews as an inferior race. So it's about racism, about race. But you all know that the Gaza genocide and the attacks on Lebanon, Yemen, and Iran are not about self-defense or security, but about settler colonialism's expansionism. And as we speak, the Likud party has announced a conference about the occupation of all of Gaza and the settlement of all of Gaza. And Ben Gvir has actually declared that this is their aim. And the media is already full of advertisements for houses in Gaza and in Lebanon. The link between race, capitalism, and racial regimes and settler colonialism and the absence of analysis of racial capitalism in relation to Palestine, as opposed to the analysis of racial capitalism in relation to South Africa, is the reason why Kieron Turner and I have decided to co-edit this special issue for the Journal of Holy Land and Palestine Studies. Kieron Turner, in fact, is the brains behind this special issue, and he writes, while debates about the importance and usefulness of racial capitalism abound with theoretical and political reference to South African apartheid and the anti-apartheid struggle, the contemporary struggle for decolonization in Palestine has not yet engendered similar debates that necessitate a reconstruction of understanding settler colonialism, race, and capitalism. So before I introduce our two speakers, Kieron Turner and Nahla Abdo, let me just say a couple of words about the issue itself. And we have a group of really impressive contributors, apart from Kieron himself, who will talk about his paper, and Nahla will talk about her paper. We have Sai Englert and Gargi Bhattacharyya, who talk about the general theories or the development theories of racial capitalism and settler colonialism, and how they can be utilized in theorizing Palestine. Muhannad Ayyash looks about the global and imperial connections, and he argues that Israel's brutal violences of land theft and the erasure of Palestinian political existence are the grounds for Israeli capital accumulation. I have an article there about basically white Jewish supremacy, and I look at racial capitalism as it operates in relation to land, labor, and the entities in carceral regime. Johnny Eric Williams and his associates compare apartheid in South Africa and Israeli racial capitalism with reference to arguing that apartheid is not just a crime against humanity because it ignores the economic aspects of settler colonialism, state embedded in apartheid. And finally, and interestingly, Greg Burris, and focuses on Cedric Robinson's theories, which is the basis of this issue. And he looks not only at Cedric Robinson's theories of racial capitalism, but also his theories of the Black radical tradition. And he shows how his ideas can contribute to understanding Palestinian resistance and liberation. And this paves a way out of the Zionist circle. So in more detail, I want to introduce our two speakers, and I'll introduce them in the order of speaking. Kieron Turner is, as I said earlier before people came on, is kind of the hope for of the next generation looking at Palestine and racial capitalism and other important issues. He's a young, independent researcher and public educator who specializes in global social movement theory, Palestine, and racial capitalism. He's been involved as an activist with Palestine Action, who are fighting to close Elbit Systems factories in the UK, and he's published about it. And he's published in the open access journal Interfere on direct action in Palestine. And he has 2 chapters in forthcoming books. One of them, I understand, has just been published. It's called The Handbook of Decolonial Theory. And he writes there on racial capitalism as a theory of history. And there's another chapter in the book Race and the Question of Palestine, which I've co-edited with Lana Tatur, on Palestine, racial capitalism, and militarized accumulation. Nahla Abdo, my very old friend, is an anti-colonial, anti-imperialist feminist activist. She's Chancellor's Professor of Sociology at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. She's an important theorist and writer on Palestine and Israel, particularly on gender aspect, but not only. And amongst her many books, I list just a few: An Oral History of the Palestinian Nakba, together with Noor Masalha; Coptic Revolution, Palestinian Women's Anti-Colonial Struggle Within the Israeli Prison System; Women in Israel, Race, Gender, and Citizenship. And this is important because it actually compares Palestinian, Ashkenazi, and Mizrahi women; Gender, Citizenship, and the State, the Israeli case; Women and Poverty in the Occupied Palestinian Territory, some conceptual methodological notes; and finally, our own book, Women and the Politics of Military Confrontation, Palestinian and Israeli Gendered Narratives of Dislocation. And we've done that 22 years ago, hard to believe. She's currently working on research comparing Indigenous women's condition in settler colonial Israel and Canada. Now, we've asked Kieron to speak first because his material is more general on theories of racial capitalism. Nahla will focus a bit more. They both will speak for about 25 minutes each, and then we'll open the floor to discussion. And as Julia said, we'd love to have your questions and comments and to engage in discussion with you. So Kieron, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hello. Do forgive me if my internet cuts out because I'm currently on my 4G hotspot. Needed more than one native to say, we've had enough. More than one peasant rising crushed, more than one demonstration put down before we could today hold our own, certain in our victory. As for us who have decided to break the back of colonialism, our historic mission is to sanction all revolts, all desperate actions, all those abortive attempts drowned in rivers of blood. So I'm speaking from the land of the Darug and Gundungurra peoples today, whose land and sovereignty was never ceded, no treaties were ever signed, and they will reclaim their lands by any means possible. I would like to speak out for the Black People's Union, especially for their actions against the imperialist British king that turned up in Canberra yesterday. And I think it's also important to mention that I am British, that my historical becoming, that it's my people that played a role in the genocide of this continent. And it's my people that play a continuing role in the genocide of the people of Palestine. And I'm not going to ask forgiveness because all I can do is commit myself to your struggles. Thank you to Nahla, thank you to Yulia and Ronit for your role here and for contributing to this collection. I guess I've been thinking a lot about this collection and a lot about its uses. And if I'm to be honest, I don't know what the uses are of writing in a moment of this. I imagine we're all scarred for this, and we're all trying to find different ways to carry on and continue to struggle and continue to fight. I guess the thing for me is that I don't want, a theory like racial capitalism. I don't want radical terms and concepts and language without action, without radical action. I think there is something in academia reproducing terms which are used to circulate in articles, to circulate in conferences, whilst nobody is taking material action, whether that's BDS, whether that's direct action against this war machine, against Zionist colonialism. And so I would ask for us to all, as myself and Nahla are talking, in which I'm not going to probably speak for 25 minutes because I'd much rather hear Nahla talk for myself, that we all think about how we can, as Amilcar Cabral said, wield theory as a weapon against racial capitalism from our own respective sites of struggle. How can we wield theory as a weapon against the continuing reinforcement of Zionist colonialism and genocide and imperialism? So I guess for me, the interest in thinking about racial capitalism is not only forms of theory from the South, which I think have always illuminated social relations and historical processes much more clearly than European theory. And the role that racial capitalism clearly played in developments and theorisations of the South African anti-apartheid struggle. And obviously, groups like the BDS movement and other organisations continuously cite South Africa as the key example of a system of racial apartheid and segregation. In fact, I've been to rallies here, down in Gadigoland in Sydney, or down in Naarm in Melbourne, where people consistently will cite South Africa, or they'll consistently cite the Vietnam War, for example. But what's consistently kind of cited in a way is this idea that people in the West boycotted a few oranges and marched around a bit, and that ended a 50-year system of racial colonial apartheid in South Africa. And I think with new historical works that are coming out, the consciousness and the oral histories of traditions of struggle demonstrate that that's clearly not actually the case. That it was the people on the ground, it was the movements, the national liberation movements, it was the indigenous peoples that were under facing US imperialism or facing South African apartheid or colonialism, that the center of the struggle was focused on themselves, and it was built on their own terms. And I think people in the West, who I assume is most of the people here, take on this idea that apparently it takes very little. Apparently it takes maybe not much sacrifice to actually end these systems of domination. And I've come to the conclusion that I don't think that's true. That I think if we are to break the backs of colonialism, as Fanon said, that is not only our role to sanction all revolts, it is also our role to materially contribute, and however we can, in destroying and sabotaging and disrupting, just as groups like Palestine Action do, the material relations which constitute Zionist genocide today. And so I guess that was the original framing of thinking about the relationships between South Africa and Palestine. So I guess I'll just talk about what I think is useful here. As I said, the BDS movement cites, the strategy of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which I think is a very useful strategy. But I think there's been historical whitewashings in terms of South Africa. That again, there is this idea that, okay, you had a racist system based on segregation, and then there was some struggle against it, and people in the West did some marches, and then it ended. But that is not the case. That is not the historical case of this. That groups like the African National Congress, groups like the Pan-African Congress, were national liberation struggles. And they increasingly came to begin to see themselves as national liberation struggles. They did not see themselves as groups which wanted equality in a system which was designed to exploit and destroy them and to upend their sovereignty. And just as the Palestinian struggle, we cannot see it as merely a system that wants equality with a Zionist system of apartheid. It wants equality with an imperialist system which has obliterated them, which has denied them sovereignty since 1917. But also the fact that it was militant struggles, okay? Not only in South Africa, there were national liberation movements in Angola, Mozambique, in Namibia, Zambia, and elsewhere, which were confronting the apartheid regime on their own doorsteps. There seems to be this idea that South Africa was this self-contained unit. And I think one of the things about racial capitalism that's useful is that it forces us to upend a methodological nationalism. So this idea that, you know, everything occurring in Palestine is just within the boundaries of, you know, the kind of colonial markers of that system, right? I mean, we're seeing that in Lebanon. We see that with the occupation of the Syrian Golan Heights. We see that with the bombing of Yemen, of Syria, of Iran. That Israel, as a secular colonial entity, its designs were never merely to colonize historic Palestine. Its designs have always been its self-reproduction as an empire, views itself as an empire, and wants to take from the Western examples of expanding itself across, you know, cultures and peoples which it views as inherently inferior and annihilatable. And this was the same with South Africa as well. That routinely South Africa was engaged in military occupation of Southwest Africa, which is formerly German colonies. It was engaged in invasions in places like Angola and Mozambique, and engaged in numerous assassinations and stoking disastrous and bloody civil wars from the Congo to Botswana to Zambia and elsewhere. In fact, it was members of the United States government, particularly the Reagan government, which referred to national liberation sites and sites of the ANC, which was working with these national liberation movements, as terrorist organizations. And if anybody's seen me on Twitter, they will probably have noticed that I've spoken a lot about the way in which American empire in the 80s, the way it spoke about the Palestine Liberation Organization, the way it spoke about the African National Congress, the way it spoke about the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, all facing and resisting US imperialism, and therefore fundamentally racial capitalism, were all seen as terrorist proxies of the Soviet Union. Okay, and just as today, groups like Ansar Allah, who have been engaging what I think is probably the clearest expression of sanctions through direct action in the blocking of Red Sea shipping, groups like Hezbollah, groups like Hamas and Al-Qassam, that they are all terrorist proxies of Iran. This is the same racialized discourses that is used by empire to justify atrocities, to justify continuing settler colonization. And so I think the usages of racial capitalism, if there are any for our struggles, is to combat the historical mystifications, because I do think history is important. I think if we have a conception of history which relies upon this notion of this very whitewashed liberal struggle to end apartheid in South Africa, then that necessarily informs struggles today, and that comes up with its own problems. Again, that we can march around, we can go to A and B's back and forth, and that's actually going to stop the annihilations of tens of thousands of people. And I don't think that is true. And so the element of racial capitalism is not only its theoretical expediency and its analytical currency in analyzing what I think has been missed by Eurocentric theories, even Eurocentric radical theories, and such as Marxism and anarchism, in fundamental elements of race and racialism and colonialism in structuring the colonization and exploitation of Palestinians and others of the Arab-Iranian region. But also, yes, the role of history and the way in which history must be wielded to confront not only the mystifications of the past that have been, I guess, bequeathed to us, that's a big word, I think that's the right word, to us by liberal theories, which have eschewed race, and therefore not only eschewed race, but also eschewed the national liberation movements and the struggles of the Third World, which always saw themselves as connected. people cite Nelson Mandela and the famous words he said that our freedom was that our freedom will not arrive until we see the freedom of the Palestinians. But I don't think people really see the direct connections that the Palestine Liberation Organization had to the African National Congress, to national liberation movements, to the Black Panthers in the United States, to members of the Black Panthers such as Huey Newton turning up in Palestinian refugee camps in the 1980s. That these struggles were fundamentally seen as historically constituted in third world struggles against imperialism, racial capitalism, and colonialism. And I think these are the ways, and these are the forms of analysis and forms of history which have to inform how we wield theory as a weapon today in our material confrontation with imperialism and Zionist colonialism. And so I guess my article is a much broader kind of general focus on these relationships for people that are interested in reading. People like Nakba have done a much deeper job in going into the historical formations, and I think really demonstrating what Cedric Robinson talked about in terms of the development of new theory, or rather, he said, for the realization of new theory, we require new history. So we cannot generate the theories relevant for the struggles against racial capitalism and struggles against Zionism without the developments and the generations of alternative and new theory. And I think Nakba's work goes very much well towards this, as well as many of the others in the collection. I think another part probably as well in my work, I don't mention it specifically, but in theorizing racial capitalism, empire, and imperialism is to, again, eschew this methodological nationalism, eschew the idea that Palestine is something over there, that we are not materially complicit, because I really believe we are. Every single one of us are materially complicit in what's happening. Every time we're not throwing ourselves against a war machine, we continue to be complicit. And there is this kind of element I've seen on parts of the left talk about Zionism as the Zionist lobby, which obviously there is one. We know this, we confront this. But this idea that the only reason Western countries continue to support Zionist obliteration is because of a Zionist lobby. I think theories like racial capitalism, theories of understanding imperialism and capitalism as a system of accumulation on a world scale, a system of exploitation across geographies, can help to combat what I think are, it's not just that I don't think they're theoretically inept or historically untrue. Again, it's also that I think they're practically then and put us in a position that is not ideologically principled, and also mystifies our ability of where are we actually attacking and why, right? If we really believe that the reason the British government, the reason the American governments are supporting the de-development of Arab Iranian peoples, the de-development, the destruction of Palestine, this is merely because of a lobby and not because of a world historical system that has been constituted by colonialism, by regimes of racialism, by regimes of gender, for the sake of accumulation, for the purposes of extraction, the ongoing ecocide of peoples and continents. Australia is an example of this, the dispossession of peoples here for the extraction of minerals, the extraction of water, the extraction of land, is of course the same that we see in Aotearoa, the same that we see in North America, the same that we see in Palestine today. This is a system of accumulation on a world scale that is fundamentally dependent upon disciplining variegated levels of humanity as expungible and exterminatable. And so racial capitalism allows us to, I think, more clearly see this beast, to more clearly analyze these elements, as opposed to this idea of, okay, we're confronting a Zionist lobby. The only reason we're confronting a Zionist lobby is because Britain colonized Palestine, because Britain saw a Zionist state beneficial to its imperial ambitions in the 20th century, and because after the Nakba, because after the establishment of South Africa, which is the same year the apartheid system was established in 1948, Nakba is in 1948, and the joining and the wedding of the satellites of what became American empire in South Africa and Israel benefits the system of accumulation on the world scale. It benefits a system which continues to oppress and keep people down for the sake of accumulation, but also to deny fundamentally the historical emergence of peoples in struggle together. And I think that's all I will say for now, because I'd much rather hear from Nakba. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Kieron, for this. Thank you for all the organizers. Let me begin with a land acknowledgement here. That I am speaking here from the unceded, unsurrendered, and stolen lands of the Anishinaabe and the Algonquin nations. Special thanks to Ronit. Kieron, I didn't know you until I saw you earlier today, but it's clear actually from what I just heard. I haven't yet read any of the articles. I haven't even revised my own or looked at it. I have been terribly busy with some of the things that you were talking about, the actual movement, the doing something, the activism that is necessary at this point, especially by academics. Our role right now is, yes, to write and theorize and bring the Palestinians to the fore. For many years, the whole Palestinian issue has been pushed underground, has been forgotten altogether. We started to reread about it only last year, and because of what the Palestinian resistance did. And that is the time when the Palestinian question came to the fore. Until then, actually, especially the Western world, not only the Western world, I have to add, much of the Arab world outside of a few countries, including Lebanon and Iraq and Yemen and Iran and Syria, outside of these countries, the rest of the Arab world has either completed a relationship, economic or otherwise, with Israel, or is silent, is deaf, is not seeing what's happening. And when the population, the Arab population, tries to go to the streets, they harass them. And that is also true, unfortunately, among many others, including, the Palestinian, whatever, authority in the West Bank. Now, I don't want to go into that. I want to provide a brief discussion of what my paper was about, and I hope you guys will have a look at it and read it and criticize it. And then I will be expanding on the role of racial colonialism, especially the British colonial, but also now racial imperialism, which includes actually not only the US, although the US is the primary one here, but also the Western world. My article speaks about the development of capitalism in Palestine and the British colonialism and Zionist settler colonial project. Sorry, I might be coughing during the time. It examines Israel's internal and external racial capitalist dynamism, including the treatment of Israel's non-European citizens. Who are these? It's us, the Palestinian, indigenous Palestinians of the land, and the non-Ashkenazi Arab Jewish settlers that the Zionist movement, in fact, has brought them. And in many cases, you can read various, pieces by Arab Jews. And these Arab Jews, remember, are not Mizrahi, and they are not, Sephardic. Israel gives you, and that is another aspect of, racial colonialism. Israel gave them the term for these Arab Jews, gave them the term of Mizrahi or Sephardic. Sephardic comes from Sfarad, namely Spain. None of these people came from Spain. They all came from the Arab world, from North Africa in particular. And, the to give them that Spanish sort of reference as if they are, Western. Spain is part of the West now. It is not, or actually sometimes they say they were kicked by, by the Spaniards, but both Arabs and Jews were kicked. And that is, part of that particular history. Now, Israel has dumped all sorts of racializing names onto everything and anything in order to justify itself, its establishment, and vilify everyone else. I mean, the amount there of racialization and racism is just, incredible. The article also explores the state's interdependent relationship with Western, especially US imperialism. And I say interdependent, it is partly very dependent, but at the same time, it acts, very dependent in the sense as you have been watching for the last over a year now, the tons of ammunitions, the tons of bombs that have been pouring into Israel from the US and from, other European countries, especially Germany, as well as Britain, is just unbelievable. And the last thing, the US discovered that, the Israeli system of defense of, the arrow or whatever it is not sufficiently working. So it sent the THAAD as with the personnel, with American boots on the ground. And this is something that, Mr. Biden has been saying left and right, that we are not going to do that. The lies, fabrications, and myths that we are being bombarded with, from the West are just, unbelievable and unfathomable. We cannot fathom these lies. The article argues that the Zionist state was created by British racial capitalism. But since the decline of European imperialism and the rise of US imperialism, the latter became the state's primary sponsor, supporter, and maintainer. Literally, Israel has been maintained by Western imperialism, especially the US, and not by its own, brilliancy. And what enabled this state to be what it is has been through its establishment until now. This is a genocidal settler colonial state. Why I'm saying that? Because the genocide we are watching in front of our eyes on a daily basis now is not the first one. Israel killed the Palestinians and expelled 75% of them in 1947-48. But prior to that, we witnessed the beginning of the Zionist settler movement, which, as Kieron mentioned, since 1917, which is the Balfour Declaration that allowed the establishment of a so-called Jewish home on the land of Palestine. Just think about it. A colonial power controlling, a foreign state or a foreign land like Palestine gives, Jews all over the world the right to come and settle. Just think about the logic or illogic of colonialism. And this is what we have been living under for all of these years, for over 75 years now. But before I address some of these points, and depending on the time, of course, I would like to begin by remembering the short back and forth, I don't know, guys, if you remember, between Macron and Netanyahu. Macron called Netanyahu and told him, you need to remember that your state was established by the United Nations. And what did Netanyahu respond? No, it was not established by the United Nations. It was established by war. What war? What was happening there was terrorist organizations terrorizing the Palestinians, stealing the land, and the land that they did not steal was given to them by the British colonial control over Palestine at that time. And let me here add one note. There was something called state land. My question is, since when the state has a land? Who is the state to be able to control so much land in Palestine at the time and give it to the Zionist, groups there? Over 60% of the land until 1940 owned by the Zionist organizations at the time, or the, whatever call it, the Jewish National Home, etc., has been given to them by the state. So from the very beginning, that fundamental relationship between Zionism and colonialism, beginning with the British colonialism, is in your face. And this is what was happening throughout that period, which I think euphemistically, or in a euphemistic way, was called mandate. What is mandate? What is mandatory when the British were executing Palestinians there, when the British introduced property relations and registration of the land, when the overwhelming majority of the Palestinian fallahin or peasants did not have the money to pay, to be able to register this land. So the state, as Marx reminds us, plays an important, a crucial role in the transformation to capitalism. And in this case, and in most cases, it is racial capitalism. So this is one of the things that we need to keep in mind. So, my response to Mr. Netanyahu is that there was no war during the establishment of the state. Palestine was not a sovereign state to begin with. It did not have an army altogether, but rather under British colonialism. On the one hand, the Zionist gangs of the Etzel and Lehi and Stern and Irgun were all armed, and many have been trained, by the way, by the British colonial army there. So it is these and other Zionist organizations who received over, as I said, 60% of the land from the colonial state. It is these armed gangs who wreaked havoc on the Palestinians throughout the period. Israel was established only after destroying over 500 Palestinian villages. And these villages were not empty villages. Palestine was not a land without people for the Zionists who were without a land. And this is one of the 10 myths, if we remember, that Ilan Pappy has reminded us in his book. I think it was 2017. Without going into Israel myths of its establishment, or these 10 myths, as Ilan Pappy writes, most of Netanyahu's utterings amount to myths and fabrications. And I have never seen in my life, a person or a system that lies and lies and lies until it starts to believe itself, until it starts to believe its lies. Palestinians did not leave, and this is one of the important, actually, fabrications, myths, and lies. Palestinians did not leave Palestine voluntarily. As I said, not just over 500 villages were destroyed. Sorry, not just villages and towns and cities. What became Jaffa is Jaffa. What became Lod is Led. What became, Haifa remained Haifa, but it changed, it became Hebrewized. So here you have, as various people have talked about it, we have all the kinds of genocide that have been and continue to be happening to the Palestinians. From toponomicide, which is the destruction of the toponymy, of the geography of Palestine, and revamp it or reinventing it as Jewish land, borrowing concepts from the Bible, from the Torah, from the Talmud, wherever it came, to be able for them to sort of identify these lands as Palestinians. Economy side, destroyed the Palestinian economy. There was, a living Palestinian economy at the time. But once again, by profoundly changing the narrative of 1947, 1948, which was, it's called Nakba. But Nakba, if you look at Raphael Lemkin's definition of the term genocide, Nakba was a genocide, killing 15,000 people and expelling more than 75% of the population, and destroying the economy there, destroying their political structure, destroying their social relations, destroying everything that made the Palestinians a nation or a people or a community. Call it whatever you want to call it. I call it people and nation. So destroying them is what Lemkin himself, a product of German Nazism, himself a product of the Shoah, has termed what makes genocide a genocide, and the Nakba was a genocide. I don't know why, when Ilan Pappy talked about it as ethnic cleansing, we were not an ethnicity. We were never an ethnicity. The different Jewish groups that are right now in Palestine, these are different ethnicities coming from different places and different countries, and some similar Arabic culture, but also ethnically a bit different, between, let's say, Algeria and Libya and Morocco and etc. So in other words, Palestinians were a nation and not an ethnicity. I refuse the term ethnic cleansing. Yes, there was cleansing, but to make it sort of, I don't know, probably academically safer, we call it ethnic cleansing. Well, I don't care much about academic safety. I care about the reality of what happened to the Palestinians. And what happened to the Palestinians was a genocide, number one, and this is the continuation of genocide. Various settler colonial and genocide scholars, including Wolf and Veracini and various others, have made it clear that the genocide is a process and it is not an event. So it's not something that happened in the past. It continued to happen for the Palestinians. There is a lot to talk about it in terms of the history of Palestine. Yes, I end up sometimes, and many times actually, focus on the gender issue, on women, not because, this is the only thing I can do, but because they are not mentioned either in most of the literature and histories on the Palestinian issue. However, the genocide that continues, we can talk about what Israel did to the Palestinians, its own citizens, namely separating them between 1947, 1948, up until 1966, into 3 different areas with no connection between each other. The Muthallath, or the triangle, was one unit. The Galilee was another unit, and Muthallath, Galilee, and Nakba was another unit. And one of the strategy of Zionist colonialism at the time is separate them, but also expanding its racial capital by expanding, taking more land, taking more natural resources, and, occupying more and more and more of the areas. And it only released or relieved, these people from that, emergency situation until 1966 is because it was planning to go for a war, a bigger war in 1967. So Israel, or the Zionist state, from the very beginning, was established on expansionist, capitalist, colonial, imperial agenda. And it is, in that sense, it serves imperialism, Western imperialism. It serves the US. I cannot think of other reason why the US is dying to send any and every kind of assistance, every kind of weapon, anything and everything. Billions of dollars have been pouring there because of the vital role that this state has been working and serving the imperialist power. So it is the West is dependent on Israel for its expansionist, capitalist, colonial, imperialist strategy in the area. And Israel is dependent on them because it cannot defend itself on its own. It would be, the pleasure of that state if more US troops or British troops or Western troops go and put their feet actually on the ground of Palestine and fight for it, because it cannot. Israel does not, in Arabic we say, it does not, لا تقاتل بل تقتل. It does not fight, but it kills. It's brilliant in killing, in eliminating, in bombing buildings, bombing hospitals, as we see in Gaza, bombing schools, bombing, universities. I have a few statistics. They're not the most recent, and I don't think we can have very recent, because the bombing continues, the genocide continues on a daily basis and on an hourly basis. But these are some of the points that various authors actually refer to now as scholasticide, which is part of the genocide. More than 10,317 students have been murdered, and more, because these statistics, I think, are 3 months ago and not very recent. More than 625,000 students are out of school. Over 500 educators have been murdered, and 12 universities out of 12 have been destroyed. 477 out of 564 school buildings have been hit, and many totally destroyed. Over 200 heritage sites. And for those of us who don't know Gaza, I worked there, and I'm so happy that at one point Ronit visited me for one day there, and she saw at least a small piece of Gaza. Gaza is a beautiful place with beautiful heritage and with a lot of culture. Yesterday we had at Carleton University, we had an exhibition called Silenced by Scholasticide. And it was done in collaboration between IJV students, that is, independent Jewish voice students, together with Students for Justice in Palestine and some faculty members. They put huge boards actually and prepared the exhibition to be exhibited in the library, which is our main library at the university. And after the okay, they received a message saying that the university cannot accommodate this exhibition at the library because the Office of Risk Management ruled against it. So having an exhibition at the library is risk management. And then they said, you need to postpone it. They said, no, we don't want to postpone it. We want to put it on. Then they gave them, a public place, which is University Center, to exhibit it there in the hope that not many people will be, going around. Even the little opening by faculty, okay, was prevented from taking place at the library. I want to say that when the state is racial and racist, okay, when capitalist, colonial, imperialist racialization also comes down to the state and to all of its institutions. Last month, we had a Pride Parade, which is the main yearly event, which used to be actually sponsored and supported by all sorts of institutions, including universities, hospitals, etc. This year, because the the Pride people got a statement out in support of Palestinian human rights, they were boycotted by universities, by hospitals, by the minister, by the mayor of Ottawa, and by everyone around. Shame. Shame. This is how, racialization comes down and filters everywhere around every institution that makes the state a state. And the state is but, a hand or a foot in the further settler, colonial, imperialist, strategy of the world. And this is what, the West wants right now, because it sees that if the Zionist state does not achieve what it wants, their strategic interests in this part of the world would not be achieved. I'm going to stop here. I can go endlessly, so I'm going to stop, and I would love it for the audience, for the people who are with us, to raise questions. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you very much, Nahla and Kieron, for speaking so well. I just realized that I had actually forgotten to acknowledge country here, which is preposterous and unacceptable. But I also forgot to actually born in Palestine prior to the state of Israel, because I'm old, and committed to Palestinian liberation ever since '67. And this is how I met Nahla, and this is how we worked across our divide. And interestingly, when we edited our book, we realized that we had a major disagreement, and we decided, instead of writing a coherent introduction, we actually presented our emails to each other about our disagreement as the introduction. Kieron and I had no such disagreement, because I've grown up since and I've understood things, and Kieron knew these things, didn't have to change his mind because he understands. So what I'd like to you to kind of talk about more a bit about this conundrum of mixing the notion of Zionism, Israeli, Jewishness, and the whole notion of supremacy. Is what unites all the issues white supremacy, or is there a specific Jewish supremacy, or is there Western supremacy? What are we talking about here, and how we can link it to the notion of racial capitalism and imperialism? Maybe I'd like to talk a little bit about that, because I see there's no questions yet in the Q&A. So maybe Nahla, you can start with that, and then Kieron can comment.
I don't think there is something in it called Jewish supremacy. Yes, there is Zionist supremacy. Now, that the Zionists are Jewish, yes, but that does not necessarily brand every Jewish person. We have been working with different Jewish organizations, people who are Jews and are, proud of their Jewishness. And they yes, I understand that Israel tried to equate Zionism with Judaism. Israel tried to equate, Jewishness with Zionism. But the idea here is because it wanted to turn people into anti-Semitic. Because anti-Jewishness, to me, is anti-Semitic. And this is racism and racialization. And I don't accept it. But I do accept anti-Zionism. Zionism is a political movement. Yes, made up of, Jewish people, but it is a political movement with political interests, with political aims. And this is how I see, Zionism. And, the Jewishness for me is a religion with the culture of the religion. I might be wrong on that, but this is how I perceive of Judaism or Jewishness. But Zionism emerged as a political, racialized and racist movement, and continued as such, as a settler colonial movement. And we know many, actually, Jewish people who left the Zionist state during this time, but also before this time, because of their fundamental disagreement with the policies of the so-called Jewish state. Jewish state is what also, Zionism insisted on using to make the mixture, Jewishness and Zionism, as if it is one and the same. So I differentiate between the two. And anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism.
Kieron, do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I was actually trying to find a quote from Robinson in Black Marxism, which I can't quite find, so I'm going to butcher the quote. But it is essentially that racialism, or the development of racializing relations, insinuates not only, interpersonal social relationships, not only worldviews and how people make sense of themselves in their world, but it also insinuates modes of production, it insinuates relations of property, it insinuates state power. As Nahla discussed, the ways in which state power and its institutions can operationalize race. Robinson also said that capitalism always carries a particular culture. And so there's particular cultural and racial elements or particular historical elements to the ways in which capitalism will reproduce itself. And I think this is part of the thing about racial capitalism as well, is that we cannot see it as merely a neutral system of accumulation that is indifferent to the lands, labors, identities, histories of the peoples that it exploits, or of the peoples doing the exploiting themselves, right? And so I think, yes, very much agree with what Nahla just said. But it's an interesting comparison too, in terms of, the construction of Jewishness through Zionism in Palestine, through the Hebraizing and Europeanizing of Arab Jews. But this is, again, this is something which, without a historical theory to kind of understand the emergence of these processes, this is something which is seen as historically exceptional in Palestine. I actually saw read it was a terrible article by a left-wing organization, and the guy essentially said, "Oh, in Palestine we see an historically unprecedented example of the working class of a certain ethnic group are taken into the ruling class ethnic group." And I kind of put out a tweet and I was like, well, W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction is calling. This was written in 1935 about the Reconstruction period and the counter-revolution of white property against Black emancipation in the American South. And to take the example specifically to South Africa as well, which is what our article speaks about, as I know this particular insinuation of racialism in the buttressing of state institutions and the dominance of particular racial castes or classes in which these elements are obviously conjoined, is that no, this has actually been a very similar case of racial capitalism. You know, the bringing together, the kind of smoothing over of social, cultural, and historical differences between Jews into and exploited Jews into a kind of settler colonial project of Zionism is exactly the same as we've seen in places like the United States, where poor whites and poor recently emancipated Africans or Black Americans by this point, those distinctions were, you know, built upon in order to build a counter-revolution against what Du Bois said could have been a dictatorship of labor. The working classes of the American South could have come together and overthrown the white plantocratic elite, and maybe even confronted Northern industrial white capital and power. That did not happen. Why did that not happen? Because of the ideological force of whiteness, expressed materially through the conjoining of poor white power and rich white power together against recently emancipated Blacks. And this is the same as we see in South Africa. So what is not usually known is that the apartheid system was not always in place. This is also the importance about our confrontation with history, right? You know, just as there's this idea that, oh, the Arab-Israeli conflict or the Arab-Jewish conflict, that there were conflicts between Arabs and Jews living in the same area before Zionism and colonialism. This is the same idea in South Africa, that there was always these conflicts, or there was always a system of apartheid racial segregation. And this is a system which was specifically designed and constructed. Where did South Africa get its blueprints for apartheid? Well, it developed its blueprints for apartheid upon the American South. In fact, it was an American philanthropic organization, Carnegie Corporation, which did a report on the problem of the poor white, which was very similar reports and investigations in the American South, in South Africa, where it was viewed that the idea of there being poor whites was necessarily a contradiction to the notion of white supremacy and the ability to continue white supremacy in a majority indigenous African land could not have the presence of poor whites. So what happened? Well, the blueprint was provided, which it was from the American South. And what we need to do is we need to uplift the poor white. And the best way that we can do that is the implementation of apartheid. Why was there an implementation of apartheid in this sense? Well, specifically, there was giving land away from indigenous Africans to poor whites, the implementation of pass laws, the implementation of employment restrictions, and the access to resources and the accumulation of power or wealth from indigenous Africans to poor whites in order to bring and conjoin people who had been, you know, existed in class contradiction and sometimes actually even racial contradiction together into a model of what one will call whiteness, or what has come to emerge as whiteness, that these historical, cultural, and class contradictions were smoothed over and pacified by the racial construction of whiteness in South Africa. And so therefore it then had to become a national liberation struggle against not only settler colonialism, but also a system of apartheid premised on whiteness. And so I think in thinking about, we need to realize the way in which racial capitalism, the way in its particular cultures have accumulated in particular sites and regimes, that we have to see, as Nakba's so poignantly pointed out, the specific historical conditions of how that has emerged in Palestine, if we are to also confront and overcome it, not only as a system of colonialism or as a system of capitalism, but as a system of racialism, which permeate the entire state structure and apparatus of systems of accumulation, systems of genocide in Palestine. That this is what we are confronting, and we need to have a consciousness of that. This is a specific historical condition of what's being confronted as a racial colonial capitalist system in order to effectively develop the means and strategies to overthrow it.
Thank you. Anybody else would like to ask anything? Okay, I'd like you to speak now a bit. Oh, yes. We have a question for Tom 6. Okay. I read it. As I was typing this, Kieron kind of answered it, but it seems to me that you are implying that what we are witnessing currently is quantitative but not qualitative change in Israel's assault on Palestinian lives and means of life, i.e., we have seen all of these horrors before and are now watching them unspeaking intensified. That seems analytically right to me, but it is all a question of continuity. Is it all a question of continuity? Does racial capitalism as a framework help us to see both deep continuities and significant changes in Zionist colonization and Palestinian resistance? It's a very all-encompassing question. Yes, Kieron. Yes.
So if Nahla don't mind me answering first.
Go ahead first. Go ahead.
So yeah, I think, no, thank you, Tom, for that question. I think it can, I think it is useful. And as you would have heard me cite before, Tom, there is a line from Robinson where he says, the point is that the construction of periods of time is only a sort of catchment for events. Their limited utility, though, is often abused when we turn from the ordering of things, that is chronological sequencings, to the order of things, that is the arrangement of their significances, meanings, and relations. Increments of time contoured to abstract measure rarely match the rhythms of human action. And I guess for racial capitalism, the point of it for Robinson was not actually to analyze capitalism. It was to understand the historical emergence and condition of Black radicalism as forms of resistance which transcended particular neat constructions of time, particular neat constructions of history. And I think, and Greg's article in the special edition, I think, goes some way towards this, but that we need to understand the Palestinian resistance and its connection to third world movements and struggles, disaggregated across geographies, but also connected through historical time, right? That this idea, we use a catchment of events, pre-state period, 48 to 67, 67 until the Oslo Accords until the siege of Gaza, right? But these are merely catchments, particular constructions to try and make sense of these chronological sequencings. But fundamentally, racial capitalism speaks not only to the structures of exploitation across historical time and its continuities, but also the accumulations of resistance, the information that is accumulated through the Palestinian struggle in a historical consciousness, which continues to inform the different aspects of resistance today. And so I think it is about continuity, but only marginally so. That there's actually a term which Alana has been using from Robert Nichols' work on land theft and colonialism about the idea of recursivity. I believe we've actually spoken about this before, where I think it's less to see the developments of Israeli kind of models of racialization, of colonization, of exploitation as kind of linear through time, the kind of accumulation through history, and more so as recursive. In fact, it's so in the sense that there's a feedback loop constantly going through, and it's developing as it's going through. So in the sense that, yes, there is continuity. In Ronit's book, there is a point about the fact that Israel relied upon British colonial emergency regulations, which were deployed specifically against the Palestinian Revolution in 1936 to 1939. When the Israeli state was then formed through the Nakba genocide, it kept those emergency regulations. Israel constantly has to be in a state of exception. It constantly has to be in a colonial state of war. But obviously it's been developed through that. The development of the Palestine Liberation Organization and the development of forms of armed and third world forms of resistance, it had to confront them. It had to develop new strategies of containment and control and counterinsurgency in order to confront them. Again, with the development of the fall of the Soviet Union, the fall of many third world national liberation movements, or their victory, and I guess, you know, the kind of counterinsurgency of them, which is what we could say we can maybe see in some places like South Africa. There then had to be a new strategy developed with the Oslo Accords. Okay, well, we're going to, you know, we're facing a massive popular resistance in the first Intifada. How do we, you know, Palestinians are once again becoming ungovernable. How do we deal with this? Okay, well, we're going to offer you some negotiations to the table. We'll talk about two states. Sure, we'll still put most of the land, Gaza and the West Bank, or, you know, which under the UN are supposed to be a territorial unity. We'll keep them separated. That's fine. And as a model of long-term pacification of resistance and of counterinsurgency, we're basically going to have this idea of a two-state model, where even today, in the face of the obliteration of tens of thousands, Western states and academics can still sit there and talk about two states as if it wasn't anything other than a colonial counterinsurgency camp. And so then when the Palestinian popular movement rises up again in the West Bank, or with the development of Hamas, the development of the Great March of Return, the development of armed struggle as the only form that is in terms of resistance that seems to be legible to people on the ground, or that people choose to do, right? You know, I think it was Amilcar Cabral that said, you know, armed struggle wasn't our first point of departure. We tried your petitions. We tried going through your electoral process. We tried doing our strikes, and we were killed, and we were shut down, we were pacified, and we were contained. And so we will choose armed struggle, not just because we're forced to, but because we have a right to. We have a right to under international law. And so Israel has to then develop new models of counterinsurgency to do this, right? And so I guess racial capitalism and the way we can wield history through it is to see continuity, but also see the way in which it's not a clean, I guess, break. Well, it's not break, but it's not a clean set of accumulations. It's not one kind of story that was necessary. As I say in my article, the kind of movements of Zionist genocide today, you know, that wasn't inevitable. I think genocide as a process is inevitable, but specific structures to which it's done, it was responding to Palestinian resistance. It was responding to specific movements in global racial capitalism. What the Zionists, well, maybe not the Zionist state, but I think probably what the American Western states would much rather is for Palestinians to just quietly be dispossessed. And Palestinians have consistently said no. The Zionist state and the imperial states of the West have to continue to develop new counterinsurgency methods as forms of resistance, have to develop that too, and the Palestinians are doing that on the ground. For me, racial capitalism, the addition here, is that Palestinians have been struggling for 70 years. They don't need to know anything from us. What we need to know is how, if the models of pacification, of struggle and international solidarity are changing through time, then clearly our strategies must too. And so I think racial capitalism gives us not only a view towards the recursive nature and the continuing developing nature of historical forms of exploitation and oppression, but it also gives us insight to how and why strategies of resistance must continually respond to those new developments as well.
Nahla?
I'm not sure what to add after this, Kieron. Thank you for this. I agree with you. I just want to make a couple of comments here. One is that the Palestinian resistance, and especially Hamas or Al-Qassam, has been resisting for 100 years and not for, just recently. We know that Al-Qassam was fighting in the hills, and, Azzeddin Al-Qassam was fighting in the hills and in the mountains from the, late 20s and throughout the 30s, especially 36 to 39. And, Palestinians did 6 months of, total boycott, and, the British were heavily affected by their economy was heavily affected by this general strike. that they came up with the so-called white paper, some sort of, conciliation between the British and the Palestinians to appease them. Because, it's only when your economy is heavily affected that you start working. And if the US right now sort of starts to get some impact of, of the resistance from any place in the axis of resistance, and we know what is the axis of resistance. It's, the Palestinians, it's Lebanon, it's Yemen, it's this, it's that. It will start to take real actions. But since it is not impacted yet, since it is not affected yet, it is, total deaf and total, blindness on what's happening. I've never expected in my life to see a world watching genocide in the 21st century and dumb silent. I've never expected this at all. I am baffled by this world, by this, champion of democracy, champion of human rights, champion of everything that has something to do with rights. And, a whole people is being annihilated in front of your eyes with the most cruel and vicious and terrorist and barbaric means, and you are damn silent. So that is, it's a killer as far as, I really, every single morning, I wake up hoping that something new will happen. Something else. I don't know why. Don't ask me, because I don't know. Just not the same thing. Now, as the person who asked the question, is this just, an increase in the amount and quantity? No, there is also a difference in the quality of the life that this settler colonial state has been living, especially in terms of orchestrating, a whole mythology around itself, around its the only democracy in the Middle East, around its, all of the myths that it created. Yes, Ilan Pappy wrote about the 10 myths, but how many people have read him? How many people know that? How many people have been affected by the reality that all what Israel has been telling us are lies and myths and fabrications? And that is not what we see, especially. And why am I saying the West? Because it's not only the West, I said it earlier. It's only those who could not resist the American hegemony, who could not resist, racial capitalism. And they are racist against their own people. We know that. Among them are the Arabs and Muslim countries and etc., who are equally silent. So my question is, what is happening there? I think Israel has played a very important role internationally by disseminating all kinds of myths and convincing many of the world, not, the people down there, but definitely the institutions there, that it is right, that it is telling the truth, that these, when Netanyahu went to the Congress, he talked about fight between civilization, them, and barbarism, us. Who's the barbaric here? And the world should see it, but it's not seeing it, or it doesn't want to see it because it's not in its interest. It doesn't expand its wills and its, its strategic benefit in the area. So there has been changes. Some, ideology can also create a culture. It is a fabricated culture, nonetheless, culture. So even, the term culture is not necessarily what, some of us understand it to be. You can, infest it with certain barbaric ideology, but covered with, niceties of the Jewish people, not of Zionism, because they refuse you to talk about Zionism. And, you know, soon enough, I would see a law in Canada preventing you from being anti-Zionist, not anti-Jewish, because the law of anti-Jewish is there and I accept it. It is anti-Semitic, and that is something that is racist and should not happen. But soon enough, you know, Canada will stipulate a law against, you know, criticizing the state of Israel and Zionism. And I'm sure that is in fact in the US, not probably in law, because it needs all kinds of procedures. So to the person who asked about, you know, quantity, no, there is quality also involved in that. The quality of, you know, changing cultures, producing a myth after myth after myth, until, you know, you're deaf of, you know, seeing or listening to this myth, and, you know, you probably believe in it. I am, you know, I mean, the Nazi Germany who did the Shoah now is with another Shoah on the Palestinians. So how can you fathom this? How can you, you know, understand this? I'll stop here.
Okay, we left with lots to think about. I would like to say that in my chapter, I actually said racial capitalism started long before the establishment of the State of Israel in terms of Palestine. It started with the establishment of the Zionist movement, with the establishment of agencies to purchase land, to Hebraize labor, to incarcerate Palestinians, and so on and so forth. We have all the elements already in the late 19th century when they declared they wanted to create the state as a colony and to eliminate the Palestinian natives. This is, in a way, continuity. In a way, it changes all the time, as race does, because race is something that changes and shifts and adapts itself to circumstances. So there is continuity. There are changes in polity, in ideology, in culture, but there is also a permanent or perpetual war against the Palestinians, as Abdul Jawad Omar describes it. And we have to remember that our aim is to resist Zionism. I was going to ask you about resistance, but you both spoke about it. And resistance is continuous. And we, anti-Zionist people, Jews and otherwise, have to join the fight against Zionism. So thank you very much, Nahla Abdo, my dear friend, Kieron Turner, my dear friend, and Julia for facilitating it, and all of you for being here with us. And the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. And I put the link, or Julia put the link for the journal on the chat. It is free access. Please read it. Please comment. Please engage with us. Thank you very much again for everybody.
Thank you so much, Ronit. Thank you, Kieron. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.